Cellist Clive Greensmith joined the Tokyo String Quartet in 1999 and performed with the quartet at the most prestigious venues and concert series across the United States, Europe, Australia, and the Far East. Previously, he held the position of principal cellist of London's Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. He is professor of cello here at the Colburn Conservatory of Music, and with his colleague, professor of violin Martin Beaver, he is co-director of the String Chamber Music program here at Colburn. Earlier today, I mentioned the Recovered Voices class that James Conlon and I teach here at Colburn, and one element of that class is that each year we feature, during at least one of the class sessions, chamber music by Recovered Voices composers performed by Colburn Conservatory students. This past spring, in the class session of April 18, we featured students in performance a second time that semester for a special, we called it case study, having to do with a quite unknown composer named Pál Hermann, who had come to our attention last fall. I will let Clive tell you more about those circumstances. And though neither of us has time right now to provide the entire fascinating story, I'll just say that April 18th was one of the most interesting and satisfying classes we've had in the 3 years we've been offering the course. And now, to play the first movement of the Pál Hermann Cello Concerto, assisted by Beth Nam, pianist, and following his performance, speaking on the topic One Cellist to Another, Reflections on the Pál Hermann Cello Concerto, here is Clive Greensmith.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be standing here in front of so many esteemed guests and beloved colleagues today. And I have a few words to say about the piece you've just heard. Forgive me for not talking and then playing. I thought it was better this way around. You get a better performance when I go on with my hands warm from backstage. And secondly, I didn't want to say too much because it might influence the way you would listen to this piece. And that's always a that's always a tricky thing, the power of suggestion. So anyway, I will start by talking a little bit about this man, Pál Hermann. He was born in Budapest on the 27th of March in 1902. He was from a non-practicing Jewish family. He lived in a well-to-do district of Buda. We don't know too much about his early musical education, but we do know that from 1915 to 1922, he was a student at the Franz Liszt Academy, where he was friends with the great violinist Zoltán Csekai and so many others. And he studied with, amongst others, Béla Bartók and Zoltán Kodály. And you're already recognizing the flavor, perhaps, of the piece. And he also studied the cello with Adolf Schiffer and composition with a very important man, Leo Weiner. And so I'll go on a little bit. He was very important as a composer and as a cellist. He, along with Zoltán Csekai, really brought the Kodály duo to international attention. And he played his own music. And the piece that you just heard was written when he was only 23 years old. After having to leave Hungary because the political climate was so difficult, he went then to Berlin and studied with the famous German cellist Hugo Becker. And of course, it was a wonderful place for a composer to be, but of course had to move on and finally married a young Dutch lady called Ada Weavers. And of course, ultimately, it was a very tragic end. He passed away in 1944, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I would now, at this point, like to share with you the very happy news that the way that this project came about was through the real generosity and thoughtfulness of some very key people. We were contacted by the school. We were contacted by Dr. and Mrs. Murray Brown, who I believe are here today, they were extremely generous in wanting to establish a fund for cellists here at the Colburn Community School Division. And this was made mention to a colleague of ours, Michael Fuller, from the Advancement Department here. And she mentioned that Mrs. Brown's great-uncle, Pál Hermann, was a cellist, and that was the first we knew of him. So wishing to honor his memory, the family established funds in the Netherlands and in Hungary, and now here at the Colburn School. The Browns mentioned that Pál Hermann had been a composer and that his work and his life had been tragically cut short as a result of the Holocaust. So Bob Elias, who is a great friend and colleague, you've already heard a little bit about the Marilyn Ziering-Conlon Recovered Voices Initiative. Here at the school with our Monday classes, Bob came to me and my colleague Martin Beaver, we both direct the chamber music program, and said that after speaking with Adrian Daly, our provost, after a nice convivial meeting with the Browns and James Conlon, we decided to take a look at these scores that have been given to us from the family. And I spoke a little bit at that point, along with Bob, to our very esteemed colleague Simon Weinberg, who also is here today. And Simon told both Bob and myself that these scores look very interesting and that we really should take a look. So Bob came in with a stack of music, and I have to admit, it lay in the corner of my desk for several months while I wondered, can we really do this? And so what had then happened, we hatched our plan, and the result of that was 4 world premieres here in this hall last April, all of works by Pál Hermann, including this piece you've just heard. how did I get to be involved with this piece myself was purely that April is a very difficult time for our students. They have any number of things going on with exams and finals and all kinds of things. And one of my students who I was really thinking of for this piece, he was also playing one of the Hermann compositions, and I thought, he's a little bit overstretched, and maybe this is the time for me to practice what I preach. And I thought, why not? I'll do it myself. In for a penny, in for a pound. So one of the reasons we were able to do this with such ease was the diligence of Pál Hermann's grandson, who is only, I think he and I, Paul van Gastel, are about the same age. In fact, Pál Hermann was born only a few years before my own grandfather. And so Paul van Gastel, the grandson of Pál Hermann, is here today, and he's come all the way from Padova in Italy. So along with Dr. and Mrs. Brown, we would really like to extend our thanks. Without their involvement, this wouldn't have happened. So in projects like this, as Bob Elias put it, family advocacy is extremely important. They insisted on releasing all of the scores to the public domain. They were freely available for us to download. Paul van Gastel ensured that we had clean copies to work with. And once the music was available, we printed it and started studying it. And by the way, as a result of the correspondence and the project here last April, we had more discoveries, and we now have found, thanks to Paul and his mother, Pál Hermann's daughter, her name is Corrie Hermann, who lives in the Netherlands, we have found the orchestral parts, the orchestral score for this movement. So I don't think that would have happened without us sort of probing away and hoping that there might be more. We're going to now try to make a three-movement work and add to it some other material, some absolutely beautiful songs that were heard here in April, which are really amongst the best of the pieces that we have of Pál Hermann. And in my personal opinion, they stand up absolutely against composers of the period. They're really quite beautiful songs, and we're going to transcribe them for the cello, and that will be another movement. Anyway, so on to the way I feel about this piece and what it was like. I hasten to add, to prepare it, I'm not a musicologist, and I'm a keen history buff, but I don't have any pretenses to be a specialist. But what I liked about this piece, of course, was the fact that it was written by a cellist, and of course, a 23-year-old cellist written probably for himself and probably for colleagues. And so we cellists could always use more repertoire, and I'm not going to tell you how you should feel about the piece that you just heard, but I confess to having loved it the moment I first tried it. I felt a very strong connection with the piece, and I continue to love it, and I continue to find new things in it. In fact, interestingly enough, after the April concert, I sent an audio recording to a longtime friend of mine who just passed away, but I was glad I could send it to him before. And he was at that point 89 years old, and he was a neighbor of mine and friend. I wonder if anybody knows him here. He was a longtime member of the New York Philharmonic. His name is Gabriel Banat, and he was a violinist and was born in Banat province and studied also, like Pál Hermann, in Budapest at the Franz Liszt Academy. So I sent him, and he managed to escape. He came here in 1944, and that was the year of Pál Hermann's death, of course. And his reaction to the recording was very refreshing. He said, "I grew up in the same milieu, but I don't know about this man. Who is he? His work reminds me of Leo Weiner and Bloch with some daring modulations." And I was very touched that he really, I mean, you send things sometimes and people don't bother listening, but he did, and he wrote back with his considered opinion of the piece. Now, as you heard, before I came to the school, I was in a quartet, the Tokyo Quartet, for 14 years, and it was a privilege to play music, for example, Debussy, Bartók, and Kodály. And I would dare to say that some of those flavors and ideas, harmonic ideas, have found their way into the young 23-year-old Pál Hermann's concerto. But I still hear, I feel, a distinct voice, and a composer with ambition, imagination, and of course an understanding of what the cello can do from a cellist's perspective. When I look at those songs, it's no surprise. He loved the sound of the voice, and the cello is what better, all the string instruments are great, but there's something about the cello that is the range, as you can see, that he encompasses in this piece. He really wants to exploit the whole range. And Pál Hermann played the Kodály Opus 8 solo sonata, and I can tell that he did from some of the writing in this concerto. Another friend of mine in New York, a famous piano teacher, who Beth used to study with, I sent him the audio file a few days ago. I said, I thought you might like to know how Beth is doing, and here's a piece we collaborated on together. And he said, wow, what a worthy piece. A less tortured, burdened Bloch. Maybe it's more under the spell of Vaughan Williams. I don't know, but who is this composer? And again, I was very touched. So, the next sort of thing I wanted to talk briefly about is when I began this project, I wondered, does the tragic end to Pál Hermann's life make me feel differently about the work? And I've already told you I love the work, but I do have to admit that I am fascinated by this man. I'm deeply moved by his life story, and I want to find out as much as I can about him, because I want to play his music, and I want to play it as well as I possibly can. And these pieces were just forgotten. They didn't exist. They were under the radar for so long. I was very touched when Paul van Gastel sent some very, very beautiful personal photographs from family archives. And you can see images of Pál with his young bride, Ada Weaver, in the Netherlands, with his young daughter, his baby daughter, Corrie Hermann. And then there were these beautiful, elegant period portraits of Pál at the cello. I looked at his hands and his posture and his very lovely smile, and I have to admit I was very taken in. I wondered then, how did he sound when he performed his own music? Of course, there are many recordings from the 20s and the 30s at the beginning of the age of the phonograph, and unfortunately, there is nothing of Pál Hermann. All we have are the programs of his concerts. So we know what he played and where, but I don't know what his style was. I might guess from players of the period. But in my approach to the piece, there were no markings particularly. I think I counted 5 markings of tempo or character. And I just followed my instincts when I tried to figure out the pacing, rubato, and the nuances of dynamics. But even without that much to go on, I was amazed at how natural the work felt and how the composer seemed to lead me in the piece. It flowed. So I shared this discovery with my students, and we all were on stage together for the concert last April, and we talked as a group about the need to be constantly mindful of the fact that life is not just about, as a musician, serving up the same pieces in the same way. And here we are at a major conservatory, and we're intensely proud of the work that goes on here. But our students should be more than just technicians who are able to, if you like, manipulate an instrument. But what is it all for? And when we find a composer that needs a strong helping hand, advocates. For me, that's when you start to become less of a technician and more of a musician or an artist, maybe a more complete human being. So from us for an educational experience, this was supremely important, and I'm happy to say that the Recovered Voices composers are strongly featured on a regular basis here at the school. Last year alone, we had, I think, 3 or 4 performances of Erwin Schulhoff's 5 pieces for string quartet, and something we're very proud of. And all thanks to Bob Elias and James Conlon and Marilyn Ziering for their initiative in this. So finally, one more topic, which is essentially a very the human element of this story. To put this a little bit even more in perspective, I was thinking about what to say today, and I thought, I'm not going to read from a book. I'm just going to share with you things that came to my mind as I was studying the piece and then thinking what I was going to tell you today. There are two musicians who I was fortunate to meet through my time in the Tokyo String Quartet. The first, I'll tell you what happened. It was in 2005, and I was performing with my colleagues at the Yale Summer School of Music. And after the concert, an elderly man with a heavy Austrian accent came backstage to me, and he asked me about pizzicato technique in the second movement of the Ravel. I was a bit surprised, and I said, rather stunned, what exactly had he heard, and how did it strike him? He said, well, there was a particular timbre of sound that changed as you moved from one end of the fingerboard to another. And I'd been laboring over this, hoping that somebody would notice it, but of course nobody ever did. Nobody took a blind bit of notice. And then he had targeted that very passage and came to me and wanted to know how it worked, and wanted confirmation of the fact that he'd heard something that he thought was interesting. This man was Hans van Tel, a Viennese Jewish emigre, a pioneering writer on high fidelity, and his father was murdered in 1938. He came to the United States and was an extremely well-regarded writer, and he and I corresponded for several months, and I'll never forget coming across his article entitled "Poignance Measured in Digits" for the New York Times in 1989. And it's such a moving piece about the power of music, and in that case it was about the Mahler Ninth Symphony performance that he had attended as a young boy, and then was able to hear that performance on a CD that he was reviewing. And so the piece was all about the power of music ultimately, and how the phonograph managed to, in a way, make us travel through time. And he was lucky. He had a wonderful, rich life, and he was a very congenial man, and I regret that I didn't get to see him much after that. I used to send him Tokyo Quartet CDs, and he would write back and say, I think I can help you with the sound. I'm not sure that the engineers got it quite right. Anyway, the other person I would like to tell you about is Claude Frank, the pianist, a really wonderful man. And the first time I met him was in 1999. In July, we were rehearsing in his apartment in New York, and we discussed after the Brahms Piano Quintet rehearsal. I knew his background a little bit, and so I said, tell me about your background when you came to the States. And I was thinking the parallels with Pál Hermann were quite strong, and he managed to find a way out and ended up in France, like Pál Hermann, but across the Pyrenees, came to Madrid and then Lisbon, and then took the boat, made it to America in 1940. And those two people, Hans van Tel and Claude Frank, of course, they were wonderful mentors too. And I kept thinking, you know, I don't want to belabor this, but Pál Hermann, his life was short, but what he gave, and he was a wonderful advocate for other young composers, and obviously was prolific, and his life came to such an abrupt end, and I thank whoever it is that, I mean, I know we've talked about who is responsible for us being aware of his music, but when we played the April performance here, Corrie Hermann, Paul's mother, she gave us these beautiful little cards with pictures of a Vermeer painting on the front, and she said, thank you for the playing today. Pál Hermann is still with us when we listen to his music. A very simple message. And so I think that's all I have to tell you about the piece. And thank you for listening so attentively, and for being here. And again, thank you to Paul van Gastel and the Browns, Dr. and Mrs. Brown, for being here, and of course Bob. And thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure.
take a couple of questions. Question, comment for Clive? Yes, right here.
I'm wondering, you mentioned about adding movements,
yes,
to describing other songs.
Yeah.
Do we know if he conceived it as a one-movement concerto, or did we lose the music? Or?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. Paul and I have been in touch over the summer about this, and he recently found something that we think might have been the accompaniment for another movement. We don't know. But we've been looking very carefully at it, and I can't say too much because things haven't quite come to fruition yet, but there may well be more material. We do hope so. Fingers crossed.
And is your rendition of the first movement available?
It's actually now on, I believe it's been uploaded onto the IMSLP website of Pál Hermann's collected works. So you can, yes, and you can hear it. It was recorded in May here in this hall, of course.
Questions? Comments?
What happened to Hermann after his marriage to the Dutch lady? That's the last we heard of him.
Well, I feel like perhaps Paul van Gastel should answer the question, but Paul had to constantly, Pál had to move from one place to another, and finally ended up in Paris, and then went to Toulouse, where he went into hiding under a false name, and then he was unfortunately discovered and taken to the Drancy concentration camp, and then it was Convoy 73, and he was never heard of again.
Yes, sir.
When you sit down and look at the music, do you decide how you're going to approach each phrase, or do you play it a few times differently and see how you're going to ultimately do it?
Yes, a good question. We did a lot of experimenting, Beth and I felt that the phrasing was very important, and the tempo. I mean, there were, I think, 5 markings in the piece, and he writes allegro cantabile at the beginning, stressing the singing line. I also permitted myself to break free a little bit of the rhythm and be a little bit more rhapsodic, and I felt that that was part of the style. Maybe Pál somewhere is unhappy with the way I play it, but I just felt that it was the kind of piece that had a sense of freedom and of time-taking that would be appropriate. But there was a lot of experimentation, and I think I'm playing it differently now than how I did earlier on. I hope it's improved since I first played it.
With your permission, Clive, I would like to ask Paul van Gastel to say a couple of words about his grandfather and this project.
Okay.
Kindly stand so we can hear.
Sure.
Thank you.
I say a very few words. I think Pál Hermann is somewhere, and he is very happy with the way he plays.
One more question or comment, and we'll call it a session. Yes, Neil.
You mentioned songs, and
yeah.
You mentioned that your cello students have played some other works of his.
Yes.
And you mentioned IMSLP, there's an
yeah.
archive. What are some of the other, are there later works also that are available for other combinations of instruments or voice or genre?
Yes, there are some piano works. There are several string trios and duos, the songs, and there are fragments. There's a theme, a fugue theme, which I can probably maybe tell you that we might be trying to create a movement out of that for this concerto. And it's what's interesting is maybe there's even more that we don't know of, but we're certainly on the trail for that. Yeah, and you'll find it all listed on the IMSLP website. Thank you.